Julian knew something was off. The second, his security badge did not beep, green at the office door. Instead of the cheerful chirp and the smooth click of the lock, a red light blinked 3 times, resembling a warning flare on a dark highway shoulder. The security guard, a young man who was all neck and no nuance, shifted his weight and muttered something about recent database changes. Julian gave him a quiet smile, turned and walked around to the side entrance. There was no scene, no protest, just a pair of worn leather shoes clicking on the concrete with the rhythm of a 52-year-old man who had been invisible for 14 years. Upstairs, his cubicle still had a yellow sticky note stuck to the monitor. It said, "Remember to breathe, dummy," written in his own hand during a late-night code freeze in 2012. That night, Julian had slept under his desk with a stale granola bar and one eye on the server logs. The entire system had crashed at 1:12 a.m. He had it back online by 1:28. No one remembered that night, just like no one remembered that he was the back-end architect who designed the predictive model at the center of Nexus Data Corp. That morning, before even brushing his teeth, Julian had debugged a core code loop from home. It had been silently bottlenecking data velocity across their top-tier client dashboards for over 6 days. 6 days of half-broken metrics that Derek Sterling did not even notice. Derek, the 32-year-old CEO and former CEO's son-in-law, was too busy renaming departments to things like innovation funnels and hiring young business consultants with degrees in disruption theory. But Julian fixed it. He sipped black coffee from his plain ceramic mug, pushed the patch, logged it in a changelog no one else read, and drove to work with the same exact lunch he brought every Tuesday. A turkey sandwich, carrots, and the last ounce of hope that someone might say thank you. They never did. By 8:17 a.m., Julian had reviewed the overnight query backlog, flagged 3 bad database queries from an overeager junior analyst named Tyler, and noticed a weird access token regeneration pattern coming from a partner node in Germany. He wrote a quick note to the engineering lead about it. He did all this while listening to soft instrumental music and eating his simple breakfast. At 8:32, he received a calendar invite titled Restructure Meeting, Mandatory Attendance, from Derek's assistant, Sierra. Derek did not use names, just team member. Julian walked into conference room Delta at 9:04 on the dot. No coffee was offered. Derek was leaning against the glass wall like a college boy, giving a pitch to his own reflection. His suit looked expensive in the way cheap ambition does, shiny tight and one sneeze away from a split seam. He did not sit down. "Julian," he said, using a voice that sounded like he had practiced empathy in a mirror, "we are moving in a new direction." Julian did not blink. "You have been with us since the early days." "We respect that," Derek said, pronouncing the word respect like a child guessing at a spelling bee. "But we are optimizing legacy overhead, and your role no longer aligns with our streamlined vision." That was how Julian learned he was just a spreadsheet cell. Legacy overhead, a subtraction problem with a retirement plan. Derek handed him a pre-folded termination letter. Julian opened it, scanned the text, and did not laugh or cry. He just looked at the final signature line, which was authorized by Derek Sterling, Chief Executive Officer. Julian slid the letter back into the envelope, nodded once, and said, "Noted." Derek blinked, perhaps expecting a scream, a plea, or a sob about pension funds. Julian gave him none of that. The escort came in, an HR representative named Miranda, her eyes wide with discomfort. Julian stood up, collected his wool coat, and walked out without even glancing back at the server room he had once slept in during a blizzard because the firewalls needed manual refreshes every 4 hours. In the elevator, he looked at his reflection. There was no panic, no rage, just a slow, small smile. By 9:11, he was back in his suburban house. His cat blinked at him from the kitchen counter. By 9:13, he opened a separate laptop. It was a black case with no stickers and no Nexus Data Corp security tags. By 9:15, he logged into a portal that was not listed on any corporate server. And at 9:16 a.m. sharp, he submitted one document. The subject line read, "Formal Notice of License Termination." Derek Sterling would receive it. 1 minute later, and 1 minute after that, he would scream a question that would shake the glass walls of the boardroom. But that part was still coming. Julian was just getting started. Tuesday, 9:06 a.m., was the exact timestamp printed at the top of the termination letter. It looked like a bureaucratic death certificate, timed to start before his second cup of coffee could even kick in. The chair in front of Derek's desk had been pulled out for him. It was a nice touch, like laying flowers on a grave before the body was even cold. Derek did not bother looking up from his tablet when Julian walked in. He just tapped the screen, probably adjusting his golf simulator app, and said, "Take a seat, Julian." Julian remained standing. Derek glanced up slightly, annoyed that Julian was not following the script. "We are making some strategic pivots," he began, using the same tone he used to describe corporate synergy. "As you know, legacy systems are being evaluated for redundancy and cost inefficiency. Unfortunately, your role falls within that framework." Julian waited for him to finish. It was like watching someone try to read financial reports with marbles in their mouth. "We appreciate your 14 years of service, and we want to make this transition as graceful as possible." Derek handed over the envelope containing the pink slip, severance packet, and non-disclosure agreements. They were all pre-signed, assuming he would nod politely and vanish. Julian asked only one question: "Is there a reason I was not consulted before this decision?" Derek gave him a smug shrug. "Is above your pay grade, Julian. Legal signed off." "Of course they did." Derek nodded toward the door. "HR will help you clear out your things. Best of luck." There was no handshake, no thank you, and not even a copy of the exit paperwork for his own records. Just a smug smile from a young man who did not know what he had just stepped on. Miranda, the HR representative, looked like she was walking a rescue dog into a shelter as they passed the IT bullpen. "I am really sorry, Julian," she whispered. "I did not even know you were on the list." Julian just nodded. He kept his eyes forward, passing the whiteboards he had filled with system designs. The junior developers who used his database diagrams, without ever asking who made them, and the server racks he had installed himself. They handed him a box with his name written in Sharpie. He could see the corner of his old sweater poking out. He did not argue, he just rode the elevator down. But just before the doors opened in the lobby, Julian smiled. He stepped out into the sun, walked to his car, and drove home with one hand on the wheel. The countdown had begun. Then the office of his attorney smelled of old leather books, slightly burnt coffee, and long game strategy. Julian sat across from Winston Hayes, his legal counsel for over 15 years, watching him comb through the yellowing pages of a contract that they had written together back in 2012. That was the year Corp Technologies LLC had signed its first and only exclusive software licensing agreement with Nexus Data Corps. Julian had been younger then, still naive enough to think that hard work alone would guarantee credit, but wise enough to let Winston slip in a few safety valves. "Clause 7.3, Winston muttered, sliding his glasses down his nose as he turned a page. "Breach via bad faith termination of founder-integrated personnel." He looked up at Julian over the rim. "We buried this deep in the definitions section, but it is absolutely watertight. They terminated you without cause, without a transition consultation, and with clear, documented disregard for your operational integration." Winston slid the folder across the mahogany desk. Under the fluorescent lights, the original agreement glowed. His name was printed in clean black ink on the final signature page. Julian Vance, founder and CTO, Corp Technologies LLC. It had been a long time since he had signed anything under that name at the office. For years, he had simply gone by Julian Vance, the quiet back-end architect, allowing the executives to believe he was just another salaried employee. It was a camouflage that kept him out of corporate politics and let him focus on the code. But now, it was like striking a match after soaking the entire structure in gasoline. "Are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this, Julian?" Winston asked, his voice steady. Julian met his eyes without hesitation. "They made their choice at 9:06 this morning, Winston. I made mine at 9:16. Winston gave a slow, deliberate nod. "If we submit this notice, they will have exactly 48 hours to remedy the breach by reinstating you on your original terms, or they lose all rights to every licensed module running on their network. That includes the core database loops, the predictive analytics engines, the real-time model pushers, and even the biometric security handshakes that run the employee access systems. All of those systems," Julian added quietly, "are routed through the same encrypted licensing handshake. It is a single master key. Even their developmental sandboxes are tied to it." They never realized I control the dev environments too, because the code does not list my name. It only checks the encrypted handshake against the J-Core Technologies registry key. Winston smiled, a thin, sharp expression. Under federal copyright law, specifically 17 U.S.C. Section 106, you retain the exclusive right to authorize the reproduction and distribution of that software. Since the license agreement explicitly terminates upon your dismissal, any continued execution of those modules after the 48-hour grace period constitutes willful infringement. We are not just talking about contract breach. We are talking about federal intellectual property violations. Furthermore, Winston continued, pointing to a stack of corporate filings. The patent rights on the predictive modeling algorithms are protected under 35 U.S.C. Section 271. If they try to reverse engineer or bypass your handshake, they will be directly infringing on your active patents. They do not have the source code keys anyway, and from a corporate governance standpoint, their board of directors is going to have a massive panic. Derek Sterling has a fiduciary duty to protect company assets. By firing you without checking the IP licensing agreements, he has actively jeopardized their entire core product. That is a direct breach of fiduciary duty, and the shareholders can sue him personally for the dissipation of company assets. There is also the matter of the sudden layoffs, Julian noted. Derek mentioned that they are restructuring the entire engineering division under the Federal War Act, 29 U.S.C. Section 21-1101. Employers are required to provide 60 days advance notice for mass layoffs. Firing key personnel abruptly while launching a restructuring campaign without proper warning is going to land them in class action territory. They have exposed themselves on every single front. Winston said he unscrewed the cap of a heavy fountain pen and handed it to Julian. Sign the notice. Let us give them their 48 hours. Julian took the pen. The weight of it felt familiar. He signed his name at the bottom of the formal termination of software license document. Julian Vance, manager, J-Core Technologies, LLC. It took less than 3 seconds by 9:16 a.m. The next morning, the notice was finalized. Julian sat in his kitchen, watching the steam rise from his coffee mug. His house was a modest ranch, quiet and filled with morning light. He had worked hard to keep his life simple, avoiding the flashiness that Derek Sterling spent all his time chasing. At 9:18 a.m., Winston sent the email to the legal department at Nexus Data Corp, with a copy routed directly to the board of directors. The subject line was clear: urgent notice of license agreement termination under Clause 7.3. Attached was the signed letter from J-Core Technologies outlining the breach in the 48-hour countdown. There was no message body, no emotional appeals, and no corporate jargon, just the cold, sharp truth of the law. Julian closed his personal laptop, took a slow sip of his coffee, and went out to feed the birds in his backyard. The fuse was lit. In exactly 48 hours, the heartbeat of Nexus Data Corp would simply stop, and Derek Sterling was about to find out that the man he had escorted out of the building was the only one who held the key. The boardroom of Nexus Data Corp smelled of panic, stale espresso, and citrus floor cleaner. Derek Sterling slammed the printed license termination notice onto the glass conference table so hard that the paper slid halfway down to the legal department's end. The junior interns jumped. Derek's assistant, Sierra, who was normally the queen of performative corporate calm, stared at the subject line of the email and whispered, "Who is Julian Vance?" Derek pointed a shaking finger at the name. "We fired Julian Vance on Tuesday," he barked. "He was just a quiet developer in the back-end department. Why is a company called J-Core Technologies, LLC, sending us a federal license revocation notice because of him? Who the hell is behind J-Core Technologies?" Valerie, the lead counsel, flipped through a thick stack of vendor files with the speed of a technician trying to defuse a bomb. She did not look up. J-Core Technologies is the original vendor that licensed us the database engine and the predictive loop modules. Back in 2012, she said, her voice dropping an octave. According to the original Articles of Incorporation, J-Core Technologies is a single-member limited liability company. The sole owner, founder, and chief technology officer is Julian Vance. Silence fell over the room. It was not the respectful kind. It was the tense, quiet dread of people who realized they had just stepped into a trap of their own making. Derek stared at her, his face flushing red. You were telling me that the quiet guy who sat in cubicle 4B for 14 years, the one we escorted out with security, owns the software that runs our entire platform. Valerie rotated her laptop so the room could see the contract. Yes, Derek, and it is worse than that. Clause 7, 3 of the 2012 agreement, states that the license is granted on the condition that the founder, Julian Vance, remains integrated in the operations of Nexus Data Corp. If he is terminated without due cause or without a 90-day transition consultation, the license is revoked automatically after a 48-hour grace period. But that is ridiculous. Derek stammered, pacing along the glass wall. We pay him a salary that makes the code work for hire. Valerie shook her head, her expression grim. No, we paid him a salary for his operational support and maintenance. The intellectual property itself, the actual algorithms were licensed from J-Core Technologies LLC under a separate agreement. We never bought the code, we licensed it. Under federal law, specifically 17 U.S.C. Section 106, the owner of the copyright retains the rights to the software unless there is a written transfer of ownership. There is no such transfer here, Cameron. The chief financial officer leaned forward, his pen hovering over his notepad. Wait. If the license is revoked, what happens to our enterprise dashboards? What happens to the real-time prediction feeds we provide to our top 5 logistics clients? Tyler, a junior developer who was barely old enough to lease a car, raised his hand from the corner of the room. It all goes dark, he said quietly. I was checking the back-end logs this morning. The predictive loop runs a constant handshake protocol. It pings a registry server owned by J-Core Technologies every 60 minutes. If that server returns a revoked status, the local database modules will automatically lock themselves. Derek glared at him, then build a bypass. We have 15 engineers in the bullpen. Patch the code, redirect the handshake to our own servers, and get it done before the morning dashboard refresh. Tyler swallowed hard and looked down at his keyboard. We cannot, Derek. We spent the last 3 hours trying to decompile the handshake module. The encryption is hashed using a 256-bit biometric salt. It requires a physical security key handshake that is tied directly to Julian's master encryption profile. Without his authorization, any modification to the handshake sequence will trigger the database's self-locking protocol. If we try to force a bypass, the entire database will encrypt itself, and we will lose all client historical data. Valerie looked up from her screen, her face pale. She added, and if we attempt to bypass his security locks, we would be violating 35 U.S.C. Section 271 for patent infringement, as well as the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. His lawyer, Winston Hayes, has already flagged that in the notice. If we push a cracked version of his software to our servers, they will file for an emergencies injunction in federal court. They could shut down our entire operation by Friday afternoon. Derek sat down hard in his leather chair. His expensive suit suddenly looked tight and uncomfortable. The man who had spent the last 6 months replacing experienced engineers with his business school friends was now staring at the digital clock on the wall. It was 9:22 a.m. The countdown had been running for exactly 6 minutes. The stock market was about to open, and their primary database was already starting to slow down as the grace period timer began to count down in real time. Did anyone even talk to him before we sent the termination letter? Cameron asked. Looking around the table, no one answered. The room remained completely silent. They had treated Julian like a line item on a spreadsheet, an unnecessary cost to be cut in the name of optimization. And now they were realizing that the quiet man they had ignored for 14 years had built the very ground they were standing on. The first attempt to fix the disaster arrived in Julian's inbox, disguised as a typo. At exactly 2:03 p.m., on Thursday, he received an email from Sierra with the subject line administrative clarification regarding Tuesday's action. The message was written with a layer of corporate sweetness that made Julian smile. Hi, Julian, the email read. There seems to have been a minor mix-up in the processing of your recent administrative paperwork. We want to extend our sincerest apologies for the confusion. We are eager to reinstate your role immediately with a few updated terms to reflect our new operational structure. Please review the attached agreement and let us know when you can return to the office. Warmly. Sierra Julian opened the attachment. The new contract was a masterclass in corporate bad faith. They were offering to reinstate him, but his salary would be cut by 30% and his title would be changed to Director of Legacy Systems Transition. It was an at-will contract that would last only 6 months, containing a clause that required him to train junior developers on the database structure. Crucially, the agreement also included a broad intellectual property waiver that would transfer all rights of Corp Technologies LLC to Nexus Data Corp for a flat fee of $1. It also included a non-compete clause that would prevent him from working in the software industry for 3 years if he left. Julian forwarded the email to Winston with a simple note. They are trying to buy the house for the price of a doorknob. By 3:11 p.m., Winston had sent a formal response on his firm's letterhead. The letter did not mince words. It was addressed directly to Nexus Data Corp's legal department. "We have reviewed your proposed reinstatement contract," Winston wrote. "Our client rejects your offer in its entirety." The termination of Julian Vance on Tuesday morning was a clear, unambiguous action authorized by your chief executive officer, as documented by security logs and the Shine termination letter. Any attempt to retrospectively classify this as an administrative error is disingenuous. Furthermore, we must advise you that any alteration of employee database logs or backdating of documents to simulate an ongoing employment relationship will be treated as forgery under California Penal Code, Section 470, and we will report such actions to the appropriate authorities immediately. Our client will not transfer his intellectual property rights under 17 U.S.C., Section 106 or 35 U.S.C., Section 271 for any amount, let alone the nominal sum proposed. Kindly govern yourselves accordingly. The rejection hit Derek hard. By 4:00 p.m., Julian's phone began to ring. The caller ID showed Derek's direct office number. Julian did not pick up. He placed the phone on the wooden table and watched the screen light up. The call went to voicemail. When Julian played the message, he heard Derek trying to sound friendly, though his voice was thin and strained. "Julian, hey, it is Derek," the voicemail said. "Look, I wanted to call you directly to clear the air. We have all had a stressful week with this restructuring, and things got a bit chaotic. I think this whole situation is just a big misunderstanding. No hard feelings, right?" There was a long pause, the sound of Derek clearing his throat, and then the corporate mask fell away. "But let us be real here, Julian." Derek's voice grew sharp, bordering on a snarl. "You cannot hold a multi-million-dollar company hostage over some technicality in an old contract. This is borderline corporate sabotage. You are putting the jobs of 80 people at risk just because your feelings were hurt. We need to resolve this. Be reasonable and call me back." Julian deleted the voicemail. He felt no anger, just the calm satisfaction of a man who had kept his receipts. He had spent 14 years resolving database errors in the middle of the night, saving the company from its own technological incompetence, while Derek took the credit in front of the board. He did not owe Derek Sterling any favors. By Friday morning, the consequences of Nexus Data Corp's silence began to spread. The status monitor on Julian's screen showed that 4 of Nexus's largest logistics clients had experienced system timeouts. Their automated shipping dashboards were returning blank fields. The clients had contacted Nexus's support desk, only to receive vague excuses about scheduled server maintenance. But logistics companies do not tolerate downtime. One of the clients, a large retail shipping firm based in Chicago, did some research and discovered that the error logs pointed to a license failure from Corp Technologies LLC. At 10:45 a.m., Julian received a direct email from the director of procurement at that Chicago firm. The email was polite and direct. "We understand there is a licensing dispute between Nexus Data Corp and your firm, Corp Technologies LLC. Our operations are currently halted due to database lockout. Is there a path for us to license your predictive engine directly to bypass Nexus's platform? We are prepared to sign an emergency contract." Julian replied to the director, copying Winston on the chain. He stated that Corp Technologies was indeed the sole owner of the predictive modeling software and that they would be happy to discuss direct licensing options starting Monday morning. He closed his email client. He could hear the clock ticking on his wall. On his secondary monitor, the grace period countdown showed 18 hours, 42 minutes, and 12 seconds remaining. The corporate fortress that Derek Sterling had built out of buzzwords and empty promises was beginning to crumble from the inside, and Julian did not have to lift a single finger to speed it up. In a Saturday 5:27 a.m., the countdown on Julian's secondary monitor finally hit 0. The screen flickered once, and the status indicator for Nexus Data Corp changed from a warning yellow to a solid inactive gray. At that exact second, the core database engine running inside Nexus's servers locked itself down. The predictive dashboards, the client metrics, the logistical models, and the internal employee validation protocols all flatlined. By 6:00 a.m., the support lines at Nexus HQ were overwhelmed. Logistics managers from 12 different retail firms were calling to report that their systems were completely down, displaying only the message, "License invalid. Contact J-Core Technologies to restore access." At 8:30 a.m., Nexus's board of directors held an emergency meeting in the executive conference room. Derek Sterling was not invited. The board had spent the previous 24 hours reviewing the documentation provided by Valerie and Cameron. The legal reality was undeniable. Derek had unilaterally terminated the one employee whose personal licensing agreement kept their entire product line functional. The board members did not spend time debating how to convince Julian to return. Instead, they focused on saving themselves from personal liability. Derek's actions had led to a massive dissipation of corporate assets. By ignoring the licensing terms, he had exposed the company to copyright infringement claims under 17 U.S.C. Section 106 and patent claims under 35 U.S.C. Section 271, effectively destroying the company's valuation in a single week. Before the meeting ended at 9:30 a.m., the board voted unanimously to terminate Derek Sterling immediately for cause, citing gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. A formal press release was drafted stating that Nexus Data Corp was restructuring its executive leadership and appointing Cameron as interim chief executive officer. At 10:15 a.m., Cameron called Julian directly. This time, Julian answered the call. "Julian," Cameron said, his voice flat and exhausted, "Derek has been removed. The board is prepared to offer you the position of Chief Technology Officer, along with a significant equity share and a complete revision of the licensing agreement. We are willing to pay a premium of $750 for the immediate reactivation of the database engine." Julian sat back in his kitchen chair, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. "Cameron," he replied calmly, "I spent 14 years building that system. I kept it running while Derek took the credit and the board looked the other way. I am not interested in returning to Nexus Data Corp under any terms." "But Julian," Cameron pleaded, "without the engine, the company will have to file for bankruptcy within 30 days. We have over 70 employees who will lose their jobs." "Then I suggest you help them find new employment," Julian said, "and perhaps review your restructuring policies next time." He hung up the phone. By Monday morning, Julian was standing in front of the door of a newly leased office suite in a quiet mid-rise building downtown. It was not as flashy as Nexus's high-rise office, but it had large windows that led in the morning sunlight. On the glass door, the new gold lettering read, "Core Insights LLC." He pressed his palm to the security sensor. The system, which he had designed himself over the weekend, beeped green, and the door clicked open. Inside, his lawyer, Winston Hayes, was already waiting, holding a folder containing 5 signed contracts. "We have finalized the agreements with the first group of clients," Winston said, handing over the folder. "The retail shipping firm from Chicago and 4 other logistics companies have officially migrated to our platform. They are licensing the predictive engine directly from Core Insights." Julian opened the folder. The contract terms were clean, fair, and written in clear language. There were no non-compete traps, no legacy overhead clauses, and no corporate buzzwords. It was just a simple agreement for high-quality code. "What about Nexus?" Julian asked. "They are filing for restructuring under Chapter 11 by the end of the week," Winston replied. "Cameron is trying to liquidate their remaining assets, but since they do not own the core IP, there is not much left to sell." Julian nodded. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. The streets were busy with people driving to their offices, starting their work weeks. For 14 years, Julian Vance had been a ghost in another man's company, a line item to be optimized and ignored. He had designed the systems, written the code, and kept the lights on while others took the credit. But today, as the sun warmed his new office, he was no longer invisible. He had built his own platform on his own terms, and the world was finally forced to look. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. Subscribe for more. Let us make your old manager spill their coffee. Julian knew something was off. The second, his security badge did not beep green at the office door. Instead of the cheerful chirp and the smooth click of the lock, a red light blinked 3 times, resembling a warning flare on a dark highway shoulder. The security guard, a young man who was all neck and no nuance, shifted his weight and muttered something about recent database changes. Julian gave him a quiet smile, turned and walked around to the side entrance. There was no scene, no protest, just a pair of worn leather shoes clicking on the concrete with the rhythm of a 52-year-old man who had been invisible for 14 years. Upstairs, his cubicle still had a yellow